What I was thinking of talking about was trying to draw together some of the criticisms and suggestions made about the draft programme and somehow putting them into some seamless discussion. There will be reference to the programme and to the criticisms of the programme, so that's still there. The official title is it the transition from socialism to communism or something along those lines, which I am sort of talking about as well, by the way, but again, not really under that title. So for want of a better title, what I thought is actually a suggestion. Don't mind if I use your old name, do you? I can use your old name? No?
Who are you talking to?
Who are you talking
to? I can use your old name. That's okay. Good. Benjamin Hill, right, suggested that what I did is actually, in that sense, look at the programme of the CWI and the CPGB. And I think approaching it that way could be interesting, because I think what it will do, hopefully, is draw some of the threads together that we've been talking about over the week, and also allow me to explore some of the criticisms and all that, and actually deal with the subject. So, this is from memory, of course, and I'm not going to deal with the CWI internationally, but I will deal with the Socialist Party in England and Wales, or what used to be called militant, because they have the advantage, while they haven't got a programme that's as elaborate as the old British road to socialism, nevertheless, compared with the SWP, it's massive, isn't it? Their programme is fully elaborated in comparison with the SWP. I'm not going to be just talking about what they've published. What's the name of their thing? It used to be Militant What We Fight For. I presume it's the Socialist Party What We Fight For. I haven't read it for such a long time, but they have published a whole series, and just like the old British road to socialism, it does have a tendency, once they publish it, it's either instantly out of date or very quickly out of date, so they're forced to republish the pamphlet, but nevertheless it serves them as a programme, just as the old British road to socialism served official communism as a programme. Okay, so whatever the name of the Socialist Party's What We Stand For is, I'll be taking that on one side and the CPGB's draft programme on the other. Okay, let's first of all begin with the question of agency. Both organisations say that they're committed to the working class coming to power in Britain. There's no doubt about that. But then as soon as you look at how that working class should constitute itself, we see the first, I think, stark contrast between the two approaches. Mark, when we were being excluded from TUSC, the Trade Union and Socialist Coalition, was in phone conversations with Clive Heemskirk, who's a nice guy. I worked with him in the Socialist Alliance on their constitution. Very hard-working, very capable and pleasant individual. He's also deputy editor of Socialism Today, and I think I was overwriting one of your articles at one point, and I spent about an hour giving another introduction to it when you were going to polemicise with Clive, describing Clive in great detail and sort of trying to create a fight inside Spew by suggesting that although Hannah Sell possibly is Peter Taft's chosen heir and successor, maybe, I thought that Clive has a sneaky eye on that particular position. Anyway, the computer went down and it got wiped out, and I didn't have the opportunity to stir shit. I know this is all going to be on film, but there you are. Okay. Clive, when Mark spoke to him, said, well, you're after two different things. You're after a Communist Party, That's what you're in Tusk for. It's absolutely true. We'll be in there. We wouldn't stand on the Tusk programme, we'd stand on our programme, we'd accept the Tusk programme, but we're not out to build Tusk as some Labour Party. That's absolutely true. We'd be going out agitating quite openly. We think we need a Communist Party. We think that the comrades in the Socialist Party in England and Wales should join a Communist Party. Pure and simple. Clive, on the other hand, I think showing why he's a nice guy but not a particularly good politician, came out and put it in this way. Well, you're fighting for a Communist Party. We, on the other hand, are fighting for a bourgeois workers' party. What? What? Are you really fighting for a bourgeois workers' party? Well, apparently. I think this shows you Clive's eagerness to argue, the inability to put forward something that isn't embarrassing. Nevertheless, it is true that if you look at the comrades in dispute, and they're not alone in that, they have this view that the Labour Party, under Gordon Brown, under Tony Blair, is an ex-bourgeois workers' party and has now become, to all intents and purposes, indistinguishable from the Liberal Democrats or the Tories. And having been snugly ensconced in the Labour Party for decades, I presume since the 1940s in one form or another, and grown to quite considerable proportions. I mean, I think they did have a rally at the Albert Hall at one point. I never went to it, but it had lasers and was it dry ice, that sort of type stuff. This is when lasers and dry ice were the cutting edge of pop music presentation and all the rest of it. It was something. But they filled it. They had 8,000 members, and I think there was a figure which I suspect could actually be true. They had more full-time staff than the Labour Party. Of course, the Labour Party had councillors and MPs, but in terms of the actual party within a party, there were more full-timers in the party than the party that they were 250 full-timers. And certainly the comrades were pointing out to me last night, sort of waiting for the big financial squeeze that we're meant to be putting on them. That tradition is exceedingly good at raising large amounts of money from their own membership. They do take finance seriously, and you can see the results in 250 full-timers. Anyway, to get to the point, having walked out and been kicked out of the Labour Party and generalising that experience on a global scale, so apparently as they were being kicked out of the Labour Party by Neil Kinnock, the same global process more or less instantly took place in Pakistan, Australia, I don't know about Canada, but in Europe, everywhere globally, all these bourgeois workers' party suddenly became ex-bourgeois workers' party, and Peter Taft reorientated his organisation towards what? Re-establishing not bourgeois workers' parties, but workers' parties. And if you talk to Clive, and I have talked to him about this, his model, believe it or not, is the early Labour Party. And I remember, again, Mark had a conversation with Clive, and I think either you said we're going to study the Daddy's book, Parliamentary Socialism by Ralph Miliband, the father of the Ed and the David. And Clive turned round to Mark and said, "That ultra-leftist, outrageous book." And when Mark told me this story, it took about 5 seconds for the penny to drop. Of course, if you're in the Labour Party, if that's what your tradition is, and if you actually aspire to recreate the early Labour Party, yes, it is an ultra-leftist book, because what Miliband shows is how right-wing, how non-socialist, how timid, how conservative the early Labour Party was. Far from being, red in tooth and claw, out to overthrow capitalism, that's the last thing that was true about the early Labour Party. Okay, so let's move on. So where We say we need a mass Communist Party. The comrades in the Spew say what they want is a new Labour Party within which the revolutionary elite, directed by Peter Taff or his successor, whoever that is going to be, manipulate this machine, drive it. And what are they driving it through? I would actually argue they're driving it on the basis is that those out there, the working class, which they look to bring about socialism, aren't going to be conscious of what they're doing. These people are going to be directed into struggle, into actions, and as night follows day, as one ball hits another and cause and effect, these people will sooner or later find themselves electing a Labour government, and lo and behold, this Labour government turns out to be stuffed full of CWI members who, when the glorious moment comes, vote the right way in the House of Commons. I think it's something like that anyway. Okay, from our point of view, we actually look to consciousness. This is a debate we had earlier in the week. And I just think to myself, if you think about German social democracy, which still I think should serve as something of a model, I can't remember the exact, where's Ben? Oh, there you are, sorry. I can't remember the exact statistic, but how many daily papers did German social democracy have?
194.
Sure, that wasn't the Independence.
No, that was
okay. That was it. But 100, yeah, okay,
so.
exactly. 194 dailies. So one would be in some Bavarian town, one would be in Berlin. I mean, you obviously got newspaper distribution problems, so you might not want to replicate all of that. But I also thought to myself, yes, having written a book about religion, and not done any great research, but read up about not only Lenin's attitude and the attitude of the Bolsheviks to religion, but also looked at this very interesting group in Russia, which wasn't it was quite sizable. This group called the Sectarians. People must have heard of these people. Well, it didn't just mean a tiny little bunch of people over there. This was a schism. Some of them also were called Old Believers. There were all sorts of different factions, very, very Protestant-like in terms of the fragmentation. But in terms of Lenin's writings, he would call them the Sectarians, and he didn't mean by that that these people shouldn't be dealt with or anything like that. Quite the opposite. Along with other comrades, the Bolsheviks establish a paper that is directed to the sectarians. And indeed, after the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks passed special legislation granting land. I mean, mostly they're taking land away from the churches. They actually grant them land in order so that these people can build up. Loads of them were communists, but a utopian communist. So they said, well, okay, you're a utopian communist, here's a land, go ahead and go to communism. We're going to grant it to you. So where they confiscated land from the Orthodox Church, they actually gave land to these sectarians. But anyway, that aside, the real point I'm trying to get at is that if Lenin wasn't out to persuade people, to make people conscious of what was going on, why the hell publish a paper for the sectarians? The sectarians actually had a whole history of arms in hand resisting Tsarist oppression. The Tsarists wanted to impose the Russian Orthodox Church on people. These people would sometimes go to Siberia, isolate themselves from Tsarism. Tsarism would come along, and they would rather burn themselves to death, than submit to Tsarist authority and worship in the way that the Tsarist wants. So Lenin is going out and saying, we want these people to come into the great movement of the Russian people led by the proletariat. So what's Lenin doing? Is he relying on spontaneity? Well, spontaneous protest against Tsarism from these people is an ongoing process. The very fact that they hold the religious beliefs that they do is an outrage for Tsarism. Lenin is trying to bring consciousness to these people. If you think about German social democracy, they had cycle clubs. They had, I thoroughly approve of it, beer halls, right? They had education associations. They didn't just drink, they didn't just cycle, they didn't just play chess, right? They talked politics in a political atmosphere. You know, politics was the air that these clubs breathed. Yes, they did other things, got fit, expanded their minds. And if you imagine the sort of party we're talking about, we're not just talking about a party of 1 million, 2 million or 5 million or 6 million, just in terms of numbers, with everyone going to their branch meeting every week, sitting around a table and studying something like Ralph Miliband's Parliamentary Socialism. And that's it. And sort of regimented around the whole country. One, people should study what the hell they want to study. They want to study the Bible or Newton's theory, or Chris Knight's blood relations, or Darwin. That is absolutely the sort of thing that the Communist Party needs to be encouraging. But a Communist Party would also, in a country like Britain, be organising paper, communications, trying to direct or influence bands, you know, music bands. It would be try to influence people in theatre. It would try to influence other people in the arts. It would be trying to organise, I don't know, summer schools on the most diverse subjects. I was thinking cycle clubs. I suppose nowadays people would organise cycle clubs, having it gone out of fashion. Anyway, the point is, what we're talking about is an all-rounded mass Communist Party who's engaging in persuasion of people. That does not mean that action, going out there on a demonstration, going out there on a picket line or an occupation, is ruled out. Far from it. And of course people do learn in such actions. But afterwards they also need then to read and think and talk. Human beings are conscious animals, and certainly the process of the working class forming itself into a class and forming itself into a ruling class has to be, in my view, a conscious process. People have to realise what they're going into and why they're going into it and what they're aiming for. I don't believe you can trick people into socialism. If you do, I don't think it ends up as socialism. Okay, under the heading again of means. We would be deliberately seeking to empower the working class. We would be seeking power and are seeking power under capitalism. But we do not mean by that, when we can cobble together a majority on a council, say in Northern England, should we call it North East England, should we call it Liverpool, that if we can manage with allies to cobble together a majority on that council, we'll take local power. We're not in the position, equally, if we're in the House of Commons and we can ally ourselves to some Labour lefts and maybe a few Greens, and we can get a majority that way, we'll go, yeah, Mark is now Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. We've done it, comrades. We'll have the vote. We'll introduce socialism. We will actually be seeking to avoid that. We seek power under capitalism, to use a phrase, without responsibility. Right? We are not taking any responsibility for the running of capitalism. Right? We will actually seek to avoid that, but empower the working class under capitalism to fight back and to ready itself to put its programme into action, and not some pale version of it, not some opposite to it. Therefore, for example, if you take the moment of taking power, it's worthwhile thinking about. We had I think it was a worthwhile debate and discussion in the paper, in the conditions of, remember when Spew and the CPB and a few others got together to form No to EU, and we ended up, whether good or for bad, saying, look, we're not going to vote for Dave Nellist because of his position on the workers' militia. And certainly I went away and reread my Trotsky and a bit of Lenin and some of our stuff. And also, of course, reread Peter Taft's and Ted Grant's writings on this particular question. Because, just like the British road to socialism, what the comrades in the Socialist Party in England and Wales, and why are they just the Socialist Party in England and Wales, by the way? Bizarre. We've got one state over us, why not organise in one party? Anyway, that aside. They actually envisage, there they are, they've got their little majority, 51%, say in the House of Commons, they put their hands up, they instantly pass what they call an enabling bill. This goes back in their collective memory to Ted Heath and the nationalisation of Rolls-Royce in the 70s. Rolls-Royce went bankrupt and the Ted Heath government went against all its professed prejudices against nationalisation and just nationalised it overnight, rushed the legislation through Parliament. That's what they say they're going to do. Meanwhile, they say because of the speed of it and because of the popularity of this programme, the army will guard that vote. The army will stay loyal. The police force will carry on plodding the streets, looking after law and order, except now, of course, it's our law and order, and now they're protecting, don't smile, now they're protecting our collectivised property relations, right? Why are you shaking your head? I mean, yeah, that's what they're going to do. We all know that's what armies do. In conditions of crisis, when socialist parties like that manage to gain 51%, we know it's a smooth, evolutionary, almost imperceptible process. And armies are sworn to abide by the Constitution. Well, are they? I've never been in the army, I hasten to add, but my suspicion is they actually swear loyalty to the Queen. Just as if we're looking for legal excuses to do things, you know, if we look at why are we the CPGB, we found a legal excuse to take the name. I don't know whether it would stand up in court, but we had our legal reasons in that sense for calling ourselves that. Could I possibly suggest that some members of the capitalist class, at least in Britain, might object to all their wealth being taken off them one night in the House of Commons?
No.
And might they possibly have connections in the top echelons of the army and the state and the police force?
Right.
Could they possibly have a word in the ear of Colonel someone or other and say, I say, old chap, this isn't quite on, and don't you think we should sort these Reds out?
This is fantasy.
Well, I know it's fantasy, exactly. So, what do we say then? We say, well, don't put your faith in the existing army, don't put your faith, sounds almost like don't put your daughter on the stage, but don't put any faith in the police force, don't put any faith into the bureaucracy of Whitehall and all the rest of it. No, we don't have any faith in these people abiding by their constitution and standing over guard, well, they might stand guard over our government or the SPU government after they've arrested them. I suspect that would be much more likely the case. What do we say? Precisely in our argument with Dave Nellist, who said, well, talk to me about this after the election, we said, we want to talk to you about it now, but if you want to talk about it after the election, let's talk about it. He hasn't talked about it, because the fact of the matter is, whereas if we have the opportunity to raise the question of a workers' militia, we do at every opportunity. So in terms of big strikes, big demonstrations, big clashes between our class and their class, in arguments such as over no to EU, we raise this idea. Under capitalism, we are certainly committed to use a phrase, a people's militia. With the election of officers, but a people's militia based on the population as a whole. A people's militia that is designed for defence and not offence, right? A domestic militia. Will they concede that? It's unlikely, but that is what we are going to fight for under capitalism, and certainly that's what we would aim to realise after the overthrow of capitalism. Meanwhile, we say, just as Leon Trotsky did, about the picket line, about the strike, about the fight to protect yourself against fascist attacks, the working class needs to arm itself, not only in the head, which is what we've been talking about, but need to arm themselves with weapons of force in their hands. So we are in favour of a workers' militia being formed under capitalism to protect the power and to extend the power of the working class that I've been talking about. Okay, what about world revolution? It's pity you haven't got your T-shirt on, because the comrades are members of the Committee for a Workers' International, which is a sort of international, in the same way that the Socialist Party in England and Wales is a sort of party. The CWI is a sort of international. Attenuated, it has the name, but nevertheless, you get the general idea. This is the grouping. I don't know how many countries they organise in. 60? 40. Well, even so, an impressive number. Except this is what we have dubbed an oil slick international. It's extremely thinly spread around the world. This international does not consist of parties of the working class. It basically consists of sects that might go from a handful of people in some countries to a few thousand in others. But even when you're talking about a few thousand, that is still a tiny number compared with the working class. Okay, so what about world revolution? Of course, just like the British road to socialism, just like anybody on the real left, these comrades talk about the necessity of overcoming capitalism internationally. Capitalism exists internationally and must be overcome internationally. So what's their strategy? I presume, having gained a majority in the House of Commons and passed their Enabling Act and looking to the army and the police force to protect that, they then go on to pass a resolution withdrawing Britain from Europe. And if they don't do it then, they would have voted that way before that. So, for example, if you've got a right-wing Tory majority in the House of Commons, and they go and organise a referendum saying Britain should withdraw from Europe, and we're talking about the EU, of course, aren't we? They would vote for it. They're quite open about that. They say, and they're quite right, the European Union is a boss's club. It unites capitalist countries in some sort of confederal relationship. And that's absolutely an accurate description of what it is. But I scratch my head and say, well, isn't the United Kingdom a boss's club? Now, they might say, if they're crazy, the Scottish people actually don't want independence, but we'll give it to them or force it upon them so we can break up the boss's club, right? Well, they might do that. They might do that. I don't know. But they are committed, right, to the breakup of the EU, and they seem to be increasingly, since the so-called Scottish turn, which doesn't make any sense to them, committed to the breakup of the UK. And if you're an anarchist, that makes perfect sense. If you're a petty nationalist, that makes perfect sense. If you believe you can construct socialism in one little country, it makes perfect sense. If you believe, like the Russian sectarians, that all you need is a patch of land that's big enough to support you in terms of agriculture and farming and all that, and all you need to do is isolate yourself from oppression, and that will be communism, okay. But we are convinced that that would lead to disaster. It would not lead to a higher level of civilization. Indeed, let's just imagine for a moment that they haven't been so foolish to force independence onto Scotland, but they come to power in the United Kingdom. What happens? Well, we'll leave aside for the moment the reaction of the police force and the army. What happens internationally? What does Germany do? I mean, all things being equal, right? What's happening in Berlin? They're saying, the Socialist Party's come to power and they've nationalised everything in Britain. Well, that's okay. Britain is a free country. We're not going to interfere. In Washington, what's going on in the minds of the Pentagon elite? Our closest ally, a nuclear power, a country that we rely on, in a certain sense, to police the EU, some mad load of commies have just come to power. That's how they'll view it. A mad load of commies have come to power in London. What do? Well, if we think that they were upset about Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973, I think we can more or less guarantee that it'll be a little bit more upset about the spew coming to power in Westminster. I would hazard to guess that what they'll be doing is sending in extra CIA agents. What they will be doing is saying, look, it's just not on you nationalising all our industries. We presume they nationalise Fords and General Motors, we presume, right? It's not on you taking over Microsoft and all these other American firms that are operating in Britain. They're ours, or they're our capitalists. And unless you hand them back, we're going to blockade Britain. So I don't know what number fleet they send, but they've got about 7 or 8 aircraft squadrons in their navy. You know, they're incredibly powerful, right? No other power matches the United States. Okay, so they blockade it. The Navy stays loyal for some bizarre reason, let us just imagine, to the spew regime. But the British Navy nowadays is no match, I'm afraid, for the might of the American Navy. I think we can assume that, can't we? Right? Okay, the Americans start to dominate the airspace. They say, well, you're not going to be taking off anything from Heathrow, by the way. And they have an air force which they can base in Europe, base in Ireland, and they can ensure that. But also I would hazard a guess that the CIA agents, as well as the local capitalists, would be contacting the British Navy and the British Air Force and the British Army and the British Police, and they would sort this nonsense out pretty damn quick. That would be my suspicion. That's just my suspicion. If they didn't sort it out pretty damn quick and they put their blockade on Britain, what would life be like, comrades? What would life be like in the socialist paradise that everyone else... This is the idea that Britain declares itself a socialist republic, and everyone looks at it in Europe and says, oh, it's so bloody marvellous. Right? Okay, we've got a naval blockade. We've got an air blockade. What happens? Well, I presume we start to go hungry at some point. I presume that in terms of oil coming in, even if they allow us to carry on with the North Sea oil, sort of little trickle that comes out of it, the oil starts running out, cars stop running. Power stations, how long will they keep going without gas coming in from abroad? You get the general picture that I'm talking about. Okay, so what does the government do? It imposes a siege economy. That's what it would have to do. It would have to drive living standards down. And if the workers objected, you'd have to get the loyal police force to suppress them and to arrest their leader. I mean, that's just what you'd have to do. You know. Meanwhile, I would hazard a guess that if Scotland was independent, people would be going north in order to live under capitalism, or fleeing across the Irish Sea, or going to France, especially people like skilled doctors, maybe even lawyers. You know, people with talent would be saying, well, I can sell my ability to labour, my intellectual property abroad. Why do I want to stay here and live on starvation wages, which is what all you're about to give them? Well, they wouldn't, would they? Okay, to keep them in, what would the government do? I mean, it might build a wall, mightn't it, in the north, not to keep the barbarians out, but to keep, well, I don't know about us lot, but the barbarians in, you know. It would have to police the Irish Sea and the ports, it would have to police the English Channel. It would have to become, in effect, a prison camp. And if you think that's an example that workers in Europe and the United States or anyone else would aspire to, personally, I just doubt it. Personally, I don't think that's credible. And in effect, that is an example of... The only defence they've got when it comes to... This is an exact mirror of the British road to socialism. They say, well, no, because the British road to socialism is based on coming to that conclusion in a series of stages. We're going to do it all at once. We're going to nationalise, is it the top 150 monopolies in one vote, where the British road of socialism, might envisage doing it over a year. But I think either road, the quick road or the slightly longer road, is still the road to disaster, although their intentions are undoubtedly sincere. They do believe that that is the way to go. Okay, what about us? Well, we have on our masthead of our paper, towards the Communist Party of the European Union. If we could, in Britain, take power by this 51% route, we would seek every means not to take power under those conditions. We would hold back. We would actually be waiting, if Britain happened to be in the vanguard of Europe, which I don't actually envisage at the moment, but just say it was, we would be saying to workers in Britain, because we persuaded them, because we're actually relying on consciousness, not just to go for it because we could, right? In other words, if we could take power in Liverpool and establish the Liverpool Commune, we would actually be urging people not to do it because we don't want to repeat the experience of 1871, no matter how heroic that was. We would be saying in Britain, wait, comrades. And hopefully, because we're dealing with an educated class, the working and an organised working class, the working class would realise that it is in their interest to wait. Wait for what? Wait for organisation. Organisation. Not just the moment of insurrection, but wait for organisation to mature in Europe. Crucially, Germany and France. Yes, if Luxembourg was forever backward, we're not going to wait for Luxembourg. I don't mean it rudely to Luxembourg, but you get the idea. If Ireland, instead of being in the advanced part of the European Revolution in terms of organisation, we're not going to wait for Ireland to catch up. So we're talking about the big, the important, the crucial, the core countries in Europe. If under certain circumstances Luxembourg wanted to leave our European Union, well, I suppose we could think about it, but would we actually want a situation of where we organise Europe on the basis of these old, I'd say feudal carryovers? Why allow a Luxembourg in the middle of our Europe? Why not have a situation, unless there's a real burning national question of some real genuine sort, which I cannot imagine in a place like Luxembourg. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that sort of stuff. The point is that what we're saying is it's certainly true that in terms of the world revolution, it could break out in a Brazil, in an Argentina, in a Pakistan, or some country like that. But crucially, what will tip the balance in terms of the world balance of forces, it has to be Europe. And the reason we're saying Europe is not some Eurocentrism, right? It's simply because of the traditions and economic power of Europe. The United States or North America has the economic power, it just does not at the present time, and one would envisage still in the future, would not have the political organisation. In other words, what Europe decisively begins, North America will complete. You cannot have the world revolution without North America. When North America goes, that is the world revolution. There might be some still countries in the Pacific, there might be some funny little places out there, here or there. It don't matter, right? If you've got Europe and you've got the United States, quite frankly, China, India, and all the rest of it would look to that bloc. If they haven't gone already, they will say, we want some of that, because what this bloc would represent is wealth. What it would represent is civilization. What it would represent is liberation. And anybody who wasn't crazy would go for it. And what would we be doing? We'd be ensuring that these places that are being kept backward under capitalism were rapidly raised up culturally to the same level. So that is our strategy. We cannot guarantee that it will work. It is certainly much more long-termist. It certainly requires a great deal more patience, right? But nevertheless, we think that is the sure road to the future. It's certainly true that a war could break out a disaster could happen, and if we're going to protect our class, we've got no choice. That is the Russian Revolution. But given the choice, what we want is a conscious, global working class, a working class that is organised either in international or into regional parties, coming to power with full strength and full consciousness of what is going to happen. No one's going to tell the working class you're coming to power in Europe and it's all going to be hunky-dory. It will be difficult. You have got to face the United States and its power. It will fight us. We don't know how, but it will fight us. The capitalists will fight us, and to use a phrase from Engels, will attempt to organise a rebellion. The slaveocracy will attempt to organise a rebellion, just as the US slaveocracy attempted a rebellion in the United States. So we want our revolution as coordinated as possible with Europe, with the rest of the world, through consultation, through planning. That requires consciousness. Okay. Last few points. Just maybe I might run over a couple of minutes, but it's just worthwhile doing, I think. Okay, what do we then envisage after the working class has come to power? If we look at our comrades in the Socialist Party, I just think it's worthwhile reminding ourselves of what their attitude was to the Soviet Union. Comrade Peter Taff, a militant, always criticising the Soviet leadership. It's absolutely true. For this reason or that reason, and then the other reason. On the other hand, they looked at the Soviet Union and said, this is planning. It's imperfect planning, but this shows you what you can do. If you nationalise the means of production and put it under a plan, look at the Soviet Union, how its GDP has gone up every year, and it got a little bit difficult towards the end, but if only we had socialist democracy, it would be wonderful. But what we need to do in the Soviet Union is protect the plan. That's what they said. In the 1980s, it would be the 1980s, as things were wobbling in Eastern Europe and wobbling with Gorbachev, Peter Taft said, quote unquote, in obviously a very considered article, not an off-the-cuff Clive Heemskirk moment of madness, right? The idea of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe collapsing is a chimera, if I'm pronouncing it right. You know chimera? It's a chimera. Okay. Anyway, it's a composite animal. It's got a dragon's body and a lion's. Anyway, it's a bits and pieces animal. It's a fiction. It's a nonsense, right? It cannot collapse, right? Well, we saw what happened. We would argue that there was not planning. You can call it what you will, but a much better description of what they had in the Soviet Union was not planning, which requires conscious. Anyone who looks at the planning system of the Soviet Union can see it was not a plan. It was a system of targets. You know, you don't double a plan, do you? So you go along and say, well, what's your factory capable of producing? Comrade, 100 million tonnes of steel. Right, okay, we're doubling it. You must produce 200 million tonnes of steel. The comrade turns around and says, yeah, but I need twice as much inputs. Oh, sod that. You just produce. And then because we don't supply the inputs, he produces steel. Now he produces steel, but either it breaks, or if it's wire, it's too thin to use. I mean, that literally was the result in the Soviet Union. Or, another example, is at the end of the month, they had monthly planning targets. So equivalent of TVs or cars, to finish the plan, you'd open up the TV box, there's the parts that you're fitting in the television, you throw them in, and screw it up. Literally. So they would talk about, I don't want a TV from the end of the month. It's a phrase. If Lars was here, he'd tell you what that is in Russian. It was a very common phrase. Cars produce at the end of the month. A larder, you don't want an end of the month larder, right? Because the engine will not be attached to whatever engines are attached to, sort of wheels or whatever goes round the house.
You don't want a Friday afternoon.
Exactly, same with precisely. Mike worked on the line in Oxford as well. Yeah, he worked on the line in that factory up in Oxford. Yeah. So that was what worked in. Well, that's what happened in the Soviet Union, except on a bigger scale. That's what it was. To call that planning To say that the working class should protect that, to say that the working class in Britain should aspire to that, I think is mad. And I don't think that was because at that time of lack of information. I think it's because they had a theory, Trotsky's theory of the degenerate worker state, and they just stuck with it in spite of all the evidence. Okay, I just wanted to start to close then, just by giving one final example of what vision do we have for the working class. I think this can be illustrated, maybe it's not particularly fair, but I think it is. Housing. Let's take the idea of housing. Was it Hannah Sell that produced a pamphlet? Hannah Sell produced a pamphlet. I can't remember what the bloody pamphlet was, but it was a pamphlet on socialism and why it's bloody marvellous. And to illustrate how marvellous socialism was going to be, I don't know why you're laughing, to illustrate how marvellous socialism was going to be, she had pictures of the houses that Liverpool Council built when Militant was in power. There are palaces, right? Absolute marvellous places that I would love to go and live in if only I could. They had back gardens, they even had a little patch at the front, right? They weren't two up and two downs, it has to be said, but they were semi-detached, or were they, or terraced? Okay, there's nothing wrong with terraced houses, but they were tiny, what I would call rabbit hutches. You know, these are houses fit for the slave class. Houses fit for people who are going to be exploited. Fit for people who had no aspirations, who had no dreams about the future. Also, typical of people who have got no dreams for the proletariat. Now, I'll just give it as an example. It's from a different tradition, but to me, it just gets my mind thinking at least. And I'm not saying it's my model, but it just to illustrate a different mindset. Social democracy, after the betrayal of 1914 in Austria, was extraordinarily powerful. Vienna used to be called Red Vienna for good reasons. A huge working class, a militant working class, a working class that was quite prepared to arm itself and fight to protect its gains. So Red Vienna existed in a sea in Austria, a conservative sea, right? But Red Vienna was the heartland of Austrian social democracy. They built a block of flats to house the workers called Karl-Marx-Stadt. People still go to it. They go to it in part because this is where social democracy went down in flames. The workers fought against a fascist takeover, right? But this is also a block of flats that people who are interested in architecture, who are interested in the future, who are interested in dreaming, go to. Because here was a block of flats that the workers not could just survive in as wage slaves, they could aspire towards becoming full human beings. I still think that's miserable compared with what we can achieve in the future. But nevertheless, we need to think in a radically different way to conditions under capitalism. So, for example, just to get our heads thinking way beyond where we are now, I would say that if you think not only about housing, housing will reflect the family. You know, how do we organise the production and reproduction of human beings? Right? If you think that the nuclear family that exists in Britain is something that goes back all the way to the beginning of human beings and will carry on forever, well, I would beg to disagree. I would actually make the suggestion that the communist household would be radically different. Karl Marx, certainly, and Engels in the Communist Manifesto used the term community of women. Right? That's what he put forward, i.e. women become the centre of the family, not in that, inversion of patriarchy, the tough mum sort of type thing. But no, a community of women. If you imagine the future, right, I would actually suggest that while people no doubt will be visiting this place and that place, under communism, under socialism, mass migration, quite clearly, is going to become a thing of the past. Why would millions of workers want to uproot themselves to go to London? to New York or Washington or Detroit, or why would they do that? Why not stay where they come from, where they know? Why not stay in their family, right? But what's the family going to look like? Radically different, right? In radically different housing conditions, with radically different relationships with one human being to another. As we move from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom, human beings, for the first time, have the chance to become fully rounded. That is our mutual vision. It's meant to be our mutual vision on the left. But what I would argue is that means affect ends, and ends affect means. And if you start off relying on the bourgeois bureaucratic state, if you start off by relying on tricking workers, if your vision for workers is nothing but wage slavery without capitalism, you cannot possibly realise human freedom. If you start off with radical measures, if you start off with consciousness, if you start off with bold aims, then I believe at least we have a chance of realising human freedom. Most migrants I speak to are the first generation, from the West Indies, say it's bloody awful weather here, and they dream about going back. They dream of going back, of course, in comfort, right, with some money, well, quite a lot of money in their pockets. That's true, I suspect, with Iranians, that they dream of going back. Well, maybe not, I don't know, but I think they do. I think they do. Dream of going back to a free Iran, yeah. Certainly with Turks, I know. They all, even if they got children with Hackney accents, they still have that idea. Look, why do people come here, right? For me, I'm in favour of free movement of people, I readily say. But why did the Irish come to Britain in the 19th century? It wasn't because of love of England, right? It's because they could not survive in Ireland. Why has migration of Irish people gone down and gone in reverse? Well, not now, but in recent years. Because there was an economy in Ireland that could support some sort of decent life. I think that should tell us something. Why are there so many Somalis in Britain? It's not to look at the sights. It's because Somalia is a shithole, right, where you cannot survive. So I'm not telling anybody what to do. That'd be crazy. And you're absolutely right. People will have an interest in visiting China. And if you want to stay in China, stay in China. I mean, why not? I'm sure the Chinese people would love to have you over there. Go to South America and look at the Andes or the Amazon jungle. Wonderful stuff. I'm sure people would do that. But if you actually take human beings, Marx talks about human beings not just in biological and physical terms. He also talks about human beings being rich in relationships. And relationships are established over long periods of time. Why would people want to, some people might want to, think about their grannies and parents and uncles, but in general, if you have children, if you had the choice, and you could live under the conditions that you wanted to and aspired to, you'd live near Granny and Grandad, and the other Granny and Grandad. Indeed, you'd have many, in my view, grannies and granddads under communism. So, to me, human beings value their interrelationships. I'm sure you're right that people slowly, over many years, will evolve towards some sort of common language. I'm sure that's the case, but again, no one's going to lay it down and says it will be English or it will be Chinese or Esperanto or whatever. But that's my general proposition. It's just, how should I put it, a proposition to get us to think differently. The idea that mass migration would rapidly increase when we improve conditions in Africa and Asia, I find counterintuitive. And, so that's the first proposition. The family. The family is the means to produce and to reproduce human beings. And that is about, again, human relationships. Just worth our while. I think Camilla today will be speaking about the matriarchal, whatever, family. But anyway, if you, yeah, oh, I think you're telling me to shut up. No. If you think about what survives of primitive communism, so-called primitive communism in Africa, what we know about ancient Greece and the ancient world from Henry Morgan, what we get in these societies is groups of men marrying groups of women, right? You get group marriage. That doesn't mean you have sex, you might regret that, with all of your wives, but you can do, right? But you cannot have sex with your sisters, right, who aren't your sisters, but you call them your sisters. That's what exists in these societies. Now, I don't know how future society will reorganise itself, but I do suspect somehow that it will reorganise it in a way that's radically different to the present situation of the nuclear family, right? That's really what I'm putting forward. And all I'm saying is that will result in a very different form of consciousness, that will result in a very different form of organisation. And that really brings me to housing, which I was just trying to contrast. Has anyone seen a picture of Karl Marxstadt? Yeah? I mean, when I look at it, you have seen a picture, you've been there, possibly? No. Oh, what a pity. Okay, yeah, it was your article. But if you look at Karl Marxstadt, I mean, my reaction to it is, oh, that's an interesting building. That's nice. And when you read the description of how life used to be organised in it, with communal this and communal spaces there and all the rest of it, I go, hey, that's a different way of living. When, on the other hand, I look at the dire, grey things that Liverpool Council put up under Militant, I would go, well, look, you'd have to pay me to live there. I mean, it's thoroughly unattractive.
Just in the Hannah Sell pamphlet, actually, there was a very plain, drab picture of a plain, drab house.
It was grey upon grey upon grey.
And the funny thing about it, the thing I enjoyed enormously, is it was the caption underneath it was, a vision of what is possible.
Exactly. Well, no, precisely my point. And that's really what I'm trying to say. And it's not that I'm aspiring for the working class to look at Red Vienna and Karl Marxstadt, but at least that's up there. At least it's starting to set sights that direction, as opposed to look nostalgically. I was brought up in a council house, right? Rather than looking back to the 50s, right? We want to look forward to the future of what is possible. That's all I'm really trying to say. So I would not look towards Liverpool Council and their dreadful council houses and say to the working class, hey, dream. That to me is not dreaming, it's a nightmare. Okay. What would we do with our programme in a broad formation? Well, it depends what the broad formation is. If the broad formation is Hopi, we will not go to it with our draft programme and say, Hopi, adopt the CPGB programme. That would be a bit daft, right, I think. Some communists might not. Okay? On the other hand, if we were in a political party that was standing for elections, whether it's called Respect, Socialist Alliance or anything else, Socialist Labour Party, we would come with our entire programme and we would say adopt this, because this is the road to human liberation. Why do we want to adopt a different road? We'll fight for our programme utterly consistently, and that's what we've done. We didn't bother doing it in Respect, so we just threw bombs. But it was within our programme. So, for example, we took the statement from the SWP's What Socialist Worker Fights For, or stands for, about international socialism has to be international. We put it forward in Respect. They voted it down. Well, that's up to them. But we put it forward. In the Socialist Alliance, if you read, there's maybe a book there towards the Socialist Alliance Party, maybe some copies there. Look at the back. It's truncated, but it's our entire programme that we put forward. Well, not entire programme. It's our programme that we put forward to the Socialist Alliance. So we should adopt this. In the Socialist Labour Party, under the name of a comrade called Mary Ward, we actually published a draft programme for the SLP, which is copied with the word CPGB taken out, it's true, and Socialist Labour Party put in, but it is our CPGB programme. Of course we fight for our programme in any party of the working class that's aspiring to come to power. Of course we should. Why do we exist otherwise? This is not some sectarian understanding of the road to power. That's why we do not have, and I don't mean that in that way, but That's why when we had the discussion yesterday about the dialectic, I defend the dialectic. I agree with Stan, I think it's so transparently there in nature, but should we have it in the programme? Should you have to accept it, let alone agree to it, but should you have to accept it? I don't see why on earth you should have to accept that. You might turn around like Saul and say, I think Lengel's read a load of rubbish. We say to Saul, as long as you can unite in practice around the demand for homosexual equality, no immigration controls, a European socialism, well, okay, that's your problem. We'll argue with you about that. Right? That's a separate question. Taking power. How should we hold back? Well, I think, it might be problematic under certain circumstances. Absolutely right. And we're not looking for the worst scenario, which I would say is world war and total collapse and chaos and starvation. We're looking to the working class emerging within capitalism, a capitalism that isn't in the midst of war, and we're looking to a situation of where the working class is conscious of what it has to do, is conscious, right, of why in Liverpool, why in Westminster we are not going to come to power. And if we did come to power in Liverpool, I'm not saying we want to start civil war, but we would be training workers' militias, we would be putting into practice our programme, we would be readying the working class. And it has to be that sort of process that we're talking about. It has to be patient, it has to be non-adventurist, right? But no, coming to power prematurely, and there's loads of quotes, it doesn't make it right, but coming to power prematurely is the worst thing that the working class can do. It might be forced into that situation, but if we can avoid being forced into power prematurely, then we shouldn't go for that particular temptation, however tantalising it might appear.
Planning?
Oh, planning, sorry. Planning. Well, look, in the Soviet Union, famously, first 5-year plan, it took years and years and years to draw up the plan. And they sent away the experts, the mathematicians and all this. This is in the 1920s. I think they began, even under Lenin, so that would be 1923, 24, they started talking about this. Anyway, all these experts come to Stalin and said, Comrade, here's the plan. It was quite realistic, right? Here's the plan. This is top down, by the way. Here's the plan. Stalin looked at it and said, okay, double it. And in the midst of the 5-year plan, he said, well, double it again. And then he boasted, it's all rubbish, of course, then he boasted, in the first 5-year plan, famously, they completed it in 4 years. What sort of a plan is it that you complete it in 4 years? Well, a race you might boast about, in terms of if you're, doing 100 yards or whatever people run.
And it takes you 4 days.
Does it?
4
It might
years.
take you 4 days or 4 years to run 100 yards. But okay, you might boast about finishing it in record time. But a plan, it's like a clock that's running fast. Why on earth would you want a clock that instead of recording an hour as an hour, you boasted that our clock, right, does 50 minutes to the hour? That's crazy. A plan should be about the orderly organisation of production and distribution, surely, right? If, on the other hand, you're setting a target, right, like you would in a military situation, yes, then we got to the enemy and we destroyed them, and we destroyed them quicker than we thought we'd destroy them. Okay. What's a plan? A plan, to me, is the conscious self-organisation of economic activity. So that means control by those below and guidance and coordination of those above who are accountable to those below. Whether it's organised in Soviets, whether it's organised in a school, whether it's organised in a particular workplace or a particular locality, wherever it's relevant, the plan should be put in place. But remember, our basic aim is radically different in the advanced capitalist countries to what the task was in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had to, in its own mind, had to catch up. We don't have that. We might want to distribute loads of wealth to Africa and Asia, but in general, look, don't take this economy, well, let's take this economy as it is and then say what we're going to do with it. Just imagine it. Okay, we were told by some comrade, which I think is the figure, 1 million people work in the city. Now, some of them might be sweepers and cleaners, but there's 1 million people engaged in parasitic activity in the heart of London. Go there on a Saturday and it's dead. What are we going to do with the city? Maybe initially we might turn it into flats. But what else are we going to do with the city? All these huge tower blocks. Or, as I was suggesting, maybe a bit too much beer in me, flatten the whole thing and turn it into Central Park. I mean, it's completely useless. Right? I mean, I'd preserve the nice buildings like St Paul's, I hasten to. I'm not a vandal. Right? But okay, what's the use of it? So you either put people in it, or flatten it, or turn it into something else. You know, I'm sort of getting more and more attracted to Central Park, as I think. But anyway, that one aside. And I'll put wolves in it, I feel, yes, exactly. It's a joke. Okay. Look, okay, then we've got, I don't know how many people are engaged in advertising in Britain. I mean, they're very creative people. But, you know, other than a bit of information and making our papers look good and all that sort of stuff, I mean, it's utterly useless. We're not out to get people to buy things that they don't want. We're not out to create artificial needs. So all of those people, not those people would go, but we'd get them to do useful things, right? Loads of people are engaged in bureaucratic work, shuffling pieces of paper around, housing departments. Well, that can all go. Social security, sorry. All of that goes. We get Lee to do something useful. You know, useful to us. Not handing out the dole and interviewing people and all that. No, let's have productive labour. A little bit of organisation will be necessary. That's no doubt true. But what it means is in a country like Britain is that necessary hours radically go down. You'll have time to sit there and dream. You'll have time to do a bit of planning. You'll have time to do the sort of work you love. And then you'd have to say, yeah, okay, I'm going to do my social duty. I'm going to do my, 20-hour week. Well, not all of the stretch. But, you know, I'll do my bit to help society out at the hospital. Or I'll do my bit of teaching or whatever. So we're dealing with a radically different society. So the difference is that if you talk about that radically different society, its aim is not to catch up with the West. Its actual aim is to make us fully human. That's its aim. And so we'll have a completely different economy. And in terms of planning, remember, we're not on the edge of starvation. Right? We could reorganise this society pretty quickly within, 5 years, 10 years maybe, all things being, going our way globally, into a form that starts to satisfy people's real needs, right? That starts to make them fully rounded human beings. I don't know if I've answered it properly. But planning in the Soviet Union was not planning. It was target setting from above. It was utterly irrational. It did not produce the results. It produced lies. Right? It did produce cars, but it mainly produced lies. It produced an enormous amount of waste. Right? Planning... Sorry, you carry on.
Okay, so what would be your approach to countries such as North Korea and Cuba, which allow Trotsky's referred to them as degenerated or deformed worker states that have political revolution but not economic one? So what to keep the planned economy?
Well, I think it's a joke, the idea. I mean, it's a bit of a separate discussion. I think it's a joke, the idea that North Korea is a degenerate worker state or deformed workers state. Okay, it's never been a worker state. It is not a worker state. It's just ridiculous. In North Korea, would we privatise whatever there is to... Of course not. It's a bit like the NHS would keep it. But you would take it over democratically. You'd run it democratically. So, to me, the idea that you've got some bureaucrat over you, and because it's nationalised, somehow makes it a worker state. Well, as Marx himself pointed out, well, that would make, was it Bonaparte a socialist? Certainly it would make the pharaohs. Bismarck, it certainly make the pharaohs socialist. Was ancient Egypt an example of a deformed worker state? It's just absurd. Obviously not. Nationalised forms are not automatically working class. The working class will nationalise things. But also what it's doing by that is socialising things. And even if we think of the word national, right, there's a clue there. We actually are for the abolition of nation states. We're for the abolition, certainly, of the state system that exists at the present time. Look at Africa. Why do you want these crazy, idiotic states? Reorganise Africa, at least to begin with, on the basis of language, at least, and actual real affinity from one people, and not colonial borders. In terms of what you're saying, Thomas, on that, I mean, yes, the communists obviously do have, on particular issues, they sit there and they, out of their heads maybe, or from their history, they come up with particular demands. But they do have, I don't know however many years, but they do produce militant, what we stand for, Socialist Party, what we stand for, which to me is the equivalent of the British Road to Socialism. Exactly as you say, though, they do tend to go out of date extraordinarily rapidly. And I like the word scientific, given the discussion we had yesterday in terms of you quoting Marx on that. So precisely, if you do take out of the head, almost out of the ether, Israelis and Gazans, or maybe Israelis and Palestinians, just ought to get together. I mean, it's a wonderful thought, and if only it could happen. But it's quite clearly utopian and not scientific. And precisely, we need a rational, we need a realistic road forward, not just a wish list of if only these things would come into existence. In terms of what Yasmin said, I mean, we obviously do need to wait for your amendments to come in to see what you're having to say. And it's absolutely true that if you take a draft programme, you're absolutely right, it does assume prior knowledge. It is not something that just exists by itself in a disembodied way. And indeed, if you take James, wherever he's disappeared to, maybe he's out there. Oh, he's going cooking, isn't he? If you take what James says, exactly. I mean, I would support such a suggestion. That if you take the Affluent programme, if you take the Bolshevik programme, you have a whole literature explaining various clauses, explaining the lot, and all the rest of it. That's absolutely the correct thing. So, to me, when comrades make the suggestion that X, Y, or Z ought to be there, maybe they're right. And I'm certainly not going to stand here now and say absolutely not. But there is a danger of programmatic slippage. Because if you look at all the issues that could be in there, or are worthy, you would end up with many volumes. And if you cover every eventuality and every issue, you end up writing something that's quite frankly massive, and it doesn't serve the purpose for which a programme should be there. It's not there to serve every issue. It's not there to cover, what do they call it, every wicket? I don't know. Every eventuality. I was thinking of a particular phrase, but there you are. So, in terms of the programme, what it's trying to do, as I explained on the first day, it's there to outline our main aims and principles. And then it's there to map out a grand strategy that will take us from capitalism to communism. That's basically its aim and limitation, right? Other things ought to appear elsewhere. That's the general approach that we would take. And it's quite true that in terms of, I think what you called them, Yasmin, the role of idiots, if I can. I mean, of course, idiots will come along, and I take it's your phrase, by the way. Idiots will come along and say, look, because this isn't in there, therefore. Of course they will, and you cannot avoid it. You cannot avoid the role of idiots, and if you do try and avoid the role of idiots, quite frankly, you'll write a very peculiar document. So, for example, if you take Paul Cockshott, we say we've got to come to power on the basis of Europe. Okay. He then interprets that because of some absence, or maybe on the basis of the text, you could interpret it in that way. Therefore, what we envisage is a prolonged period of capitalism in Europe under the rule of the working class. I mean, okay, that's what he says is in the text. Okay. Nick did the same thing. Not in this session, But because we actually have a formulation saying we stand for freedom of parties to operate under the rule of the working class, and this is me paraphrasing, I hasten to add, as long as they accept the socialist constitution. Nick assumes from that...
That's fine, I haven't got a problem with that. It's what comes next after that.
What comes what?
That particular phrase isn't an issue. We've discussed this in ourselves. And what we had a problem with was we accept the possibility of one revolutionary party or a coalition of parties replacing another peacefully. We thought that could be interpreted as meaning that only parties which we deem to be revolutionary.
Okay, I'm still trying to make the exact same point. Okay, but Nick interprets that as saying, therefore, we stand for the banning of bourgeois parties. Right? It is possible. I'm not accusing you of being an idiot, by the way, Nick, so please forgive me. I wasn't trying to imply anything of the sort. But yes, you're going to find passages like that. I'm going to interpret like this. Well, all I'm going to say is that there will be many, many, many passages. You can go through the whole lot, and if one wants to find those sort of interpretations, you will. All we can say is, in terms of our literature, like, for example, Whitroad, and in terms of our entire history, no, we don't stand for that. Right? We stand for the right of bourgeois parties to exist and stand in elections. That's what we... Do we envisage, right, bourgeois parties under the conditions we're talking about winning? No, we don't envisage that, quite frankly. That's what we're saying. Okay, so we need to explain that in the press. Okay, exactly. Nick, also on it, if I get it right, also talked about the workers' militia, that we only fight for that after workers' power. Well, no, we fight for it now. So these things need to be explained, and merely because there's an absence in this part of the programme or that part of the programme, yes, we need to explain that, and people will come along and get it wrong, and we need to explain it. Now, whether that means it all needs to be in the programme, or we need to cover every single base, that's the word I was looking for, I think not. That's my own approach to it. If anything, I mean, there's about one thing I agree with Tina, just one, and that is, if anything, and I do profoundly disagree with it, if anything, we need to also, as well as saying this ought to be in, that ought to be in, what about this, what about that, that's important, this is important, what about this, what about that, what about if someone argued that, as well as doing that, which is quite legitimate, right? I'm not saying that this shouldn't take place, someone coming along and say, well, this, what about this should be in there. We need to be doing the opposite. We actually want to keep it at readable form. It is a document we want to hand to people and say, read this. Not as a dictionary of what does the CPGB say under A or B or Z. You know, that it's not that, right? It's meant to be a very clear, very concise, minimal programme. Not in the sense of minimum maximum, but we want to try to struggle to keep the words down. That's absolutely right, what Tina said on that particular question. So we've all got the temptation of programmatic slippage or programmatic ballooning. Let us explain this. Let us add that. And sometimes the comments, of course, will be absolutely right. But we've also, at the same time, going to have to fight for programmatic crystallisation and clarity. It's an art, you know, and we have to keep battling towards it. Okay, I'll do my best. Okay, let me deal with Tina's. Well, we've had numerous articles, absolutely numerous articles, on our programmatic method. So I'm surprised that Tina says she doesn't understand or doesn't see a programmatic method in what we're doing. I mean, literally, since we began as an organisation in 1981, we've said that the main job of the Provisional Central Committee, why it exists, is to equip the Communist Party with a programme. Right? That is why we exist. That is why we write articles. That is what this organisation is for. So I was quite surprised by that. We've also had numerous debates at this Communist University in relationship to the transitional programme, in relationship to the minimum maximum programme, the approach of Marxism, as opposed to pre-Marxism and, for example, criticisms of Trotsky, which is what I did today, in that sense, defended the minimum-maximum programme against an example of one of our nearest rivals. Okay, so maybe Tina's right in terms of too many details, but I was amazed. I mean, you thought it's weird to have hours in it. I mean, I find that weird. If you take one of the biggest mass movements of the 19th century, which Marxism organised around, the 10-hour day. If I put forward the 10-hour day now, I would agree, that's weird. That is weird. But the idea that the reduction of the working day is not a demand that we should specify, and I think we should actually name the hours. Maybe we should lower it down. But this is under capitalism now, when we've got, according to everyone I meet who's working, a drift towards more and more hours. We want the opposite. So I think that in terms of the tradition, what Marxism fought for, and the working class was mobilised in huge numbers in Britain, the 10-hour day bill is what they fought for. I definitely don't apologise for that. Quite the opposite. I think that needs to be in there. I'm not saying it needs to be expanded. It needs to be fought for. That's certainly true. So I don't apologise for that. And the idea that democracy in our programme is tacked on, again, I'm just stunned. Again, from the beginning, from the absolute beginning of our organisation, we fought for democracy in the party, in this society of capitalism, and of course we fought for democracy in the Soviet Union. We are extreme Democrats. I mean, okay, let's go through the programme, but the idea that we've, how did we begin it? We did not begin it. We've reordered it actually to precisely strengthen it in terms of the democracy side of it. But it's certainly not tacked on, Tina. So I do find that, to use your phrase, weird. Okay, just coming on to Simon, I thought raised up an important point. Look, we are certainly not turning around to comrades in the campaign against climate change. We're certainly not turning around to them and saying, don't bother, wait till you've got a mass communist party, wait till we're ready to take power across Europe and we're just about to go and take power in America. Ditto, if we take people whose housing benefit is just being cut, unemployment being cut, wages being cut, who are being sacked, who are threatened with a sack, who are threatened with this draconian Tory government. The last thing any communist should say to people as they're coming out onto the streets is wait, we aren't ready, we're your leadership, please go back. Quite the opposite. But we do want to go to them and say, if you want to win, just going out onto the streets is not enough, right? That's what we're trying to say. We are not, in the words of, is it Mike or is it Mark Mulholland? Mark Mulholland. We're certainly not, and I really want to go away and look up what is to be done. We're certainly not saying to the spontaneous movement, we want to hold it back. Quite the opposite. We welcome the spontaneous movement. We welcome justified anger and justified action by the working class and other sections of the population. All we're saying to them is, you're angry, but the left is not ready, right, to put themselves into a position where we can realistically lead that to socialism. So our criticism is of the left. Our criticism is of ourselves. The last thing we want to do, faced with all these urgent questions, is to say, hold back, we aren't ready. The opposite. We need to get our act together, right? That's the urgency in it. I don't think there's any contradiction between the two. Okay. Okay, I'm not going to answer that one. Yeah, okay, let me just deal with this question of nationalisation. What we're actually talking about, and again, maybe this needs explaining either in the programme, but certainly outside the programme. If you take production at the present stage of a car, is it national? I mean, are cars in Britain produced nationally, or do the engines come from Europe and the design comes from Japan and I don't know what comes from... No, what we've got increasingly is globalised production. And what we're saying precisely to those who've got a national road to socialism, what we're saying precisely to those with a national road to socialism is the idea of nationalising the British car industry, right, without taking into account that the parts are made, or some parts are made in Japan, some parts are made in Europe, etc. That is reactionary. That's what we're actually talking about. That's the idea, right? So what we're saying is the working class needs to lay hold of that on the appropriate scale. The breaking up of these concerns is reactionary. That's the idea behind it. Okay. Just lastly on Anne's points. Africa and that whole question. No, we definitely are not committed to red commissars going out from the equivalent of London and New York and going down there to Lagos or your Tanzania and the herding peoples down there and turning up, landing in our plane or helicopter and say, you are now liberated. Your cattle are now socialised property. They're the property of the people, or something along those lines. No, we're definitely not doing that. What we're saying, and this is the image which we're trying to convey, is okay, we've come to power in the metropolitan centres of capitalism. We've taken Europe, we've taken Japan, I don't know what else, but we've taken the United States. That's decisively the world economy. And we're turning around, if they haven't come with us already, we're turning around and say, well, one, we're going to help your development, and if you want some of it, we're supplying. If you want some of the riches and some of the advantages which we can offer, it's there. So we're certainly not coming along with a gun or some know-all that says we're bringing you liberation. Quite the opposite. We want to empower people, and we want people to liberate themselves. So there's no project of, if I can use it, communist colonialism involved. And if people want to stay, for example, as they might, I could envisage some want to stay, for example, as hunter-gatherers. Okay, fair enough. We're not going to force anybody to abandon hunter-gathering. Carry on. It's a nice lifestyle. If you want to do it, do it. Why should we worry about that? We're not out to force these people into a socialist factory or into a socialist office block. Okay, so I think we can be utterly, totally, 100% relaxed about that. Ditto, if someone wants to carry on croft farming in the Outer Hebrides, yeah, sure. Okay, well, what on earth should we worry about that for? It's like Mike talking about the petty bourgeoisie. We're not going to pass a law abolishing them. We are going to try to create conditions that enable them to join the socialised production thing. And if someone wants to run a paper shop, well, okay, they can run a paper shop. We're not, though, in favour of them exploiting their wives and children. We want the wives and children to be autonomous and thinking individuals, that they also want the development. But anyway, I'm not going to get too involved with paper shops and all the rest of it. But okay, in terms of your other points, community of women, looking back, romanticised vision of primitive communism. But I don't think I'm trying to project a romanticised vision of primitive communism, because I didn't really talk about primitive communism. I'm just saying that under primitive communism, people were free. People were free. And if you look at contemporary examples of what remains in little pockets of primitive communism, people are free. It's a nice lifestyle, actually. What is it? Is it Michael Solanis? Is it, if I'm getting the guy right? But a guy wrote in the 60s, I think, a book or a pamphlet called The First Affluent Society, which is sort of correcting Engels, that life for primitive communist people was desperate and poverty-stricken, and it really was a nasty time. Quite the opposite. They have loads of time for leisure, loads of time for fun, right? So if that's romantic, okay, but that seems to be what existed, that seems to be what exists. If you look at even Henry Morgan in his book Ancient Society, he actually talks about a dialectical return. If you look at classical Marxism, our tradition, talks about a dialectical return. That's what the dialectic is. In terms of society, we want communism. That communism almost certainly will have some of the features of primitive communism, but on a higher level. Yes, that's right. And so I raise up the question of the community of women in that spirit. And I was trying to think in that sense that if we're going to return to primitive communism at a higher level of society, Henry Morgan describes the situation, if you're talking about male violence, and it's an absolutely valid question to bring up, he talks about, is it the Iroquois? Iroquois. Oh, right. He tells me I pronounce it wrong, you tell me.
He's right.
Anyway, you know who I mean. Okay. Henry Morgan, this guy, went over there and studied these people, and he describes the situation in the longhouse. The longhouse is where the family lives. There's mum, sister, husband, mother, blah, blah, in this bloody big house. Right? Not a tiny little hut, but a big house. Okay, so I'd say your husband, that wouldn't work. Your husband, right, is getting out of line. Right? What happens? Does the woman say, oh, I must go off because my husband is bullying me? Right? My husband is shouting at me. My husband isn't doing any work. Henry Morgan describes the situation in these North American primitive people of where wife turns around and basically says, you know the phrase, take your blanket, is it? And caboose, or piss off in our language. Scram. And if he doesn't scram, then mum comes along, sisters come along, and brothers come along. And he hasn't got any choice. He's got to go back to mum and dad. Right? Yeah, that's right. That's under primitive communism. Right? Is that romanticised? No. That's how we used to live. Right? Now, all I'm saying is if we want to imagine the future, we can imagine the future in science fiction, in a technical way. And we can say communism is all about having loads of goodies, and it's about sending out people to the moon and colonising Mars and having super-duper computers and super-duper technology, and we can have everything we want and there's no problems and all the rest of it. Maybe. But my version of communism is about relations between people. And what I'm saying is if you take that example from primitive communism, to me that tells us more about our advanced communism than anyone will in terms of talking about computers and giant factories and whiz-bang wallop machinery. To me, yes, we need a level of material culture for the society of the future, but the crucial question is revolutionising the relationship between people. That is the main thing that we need to get over. That's why I raise up the community of women. It gets us to think outside the box. This isn't just about the nuclear family. And of course, Anne is absolutely right. Under present circumstances, if you're a woman with 2 children or 3 children or more, and your husband is beating you up, what the hell do you do? If you're not rich, if you're an ordinary person, right, you're in an incredibly difficult situation. Even, as you quite rightly point out, with 24-hour creches, you've got to earn some money, or you've got to go to the Social Security office and ask for some handouts. It's a humiliating, dehumanising situation. So I'm not arguing that we shouldn't put in measures to help those individuals in the now, but I'm also trying to say that in terms of that particular problem, there's a radically different way of approaching male bullying. And that is shift power back to women, back to their relationships with their men. And I don't think there's anything romanticised about that. My version of our communism is exactly a return to primitive communism, but on a higher level. That to me is the society of the future.